David Seymour is now willing to rule out people with grievous and irremediable conditions from his euthanasia bill. This means it may only apply to terminally ill people with 6 months to live. The Justice Select Committee tabled its report on the end-of-life choice bill in Parliament today, while a group of lawyers has formed to fight the move to allow people to get a doctor to give them a fatal injection. It's made a number of technical changes, including extending the date the new law would take effect by 6 months to allow government agencies more time to prepare. The report also recommends people should be able to administer the lethal dose themselves. At present, the bill just specifies a medical practitioner. I took the ACT Party leader through some of the contentious aspects of his bill, starting with the age restriction of 18 years. The Attorney-General considered this might be a breach of our human rights provisions, so I asked David Seymour if he would be comfortable for children as young as 16 to choose euthanasia.
I very deliberately put 18 in this bill. That is the age of adulthood for most decisions that New Zealanders are able to make. And I don't want to get into an argument about what the Attorney-General said, but if you go to the next paragraph from the one you've just read, he actually said that Parliament always has to choose an age. It's chosen a range of ages for different things, and Parliament is quite within its right to choose the age of 18, which is what it's done.
How can you guarantee that there'll be no creep? Belgium includes children of all ages, and as you would know, children under 12 have been killed there using euthanasia legislation.
Well, that's not quite right, but ultimately Belgium
What's not right about that, Mr Seymour? A child the age of 9, a child the age of 11, and a child and a child who's 17 in most recent times have ended their lives under this law.
Okay, well there you go. I mean, you said that they've been killed. That's quite a different criteria from what actually happened. Look, they've developed protocols there that I disagree with, that no English-speaking country that has an assisted dying law has considered, and ultimately the way they did that is they actually had to go back to their Parliament and pass another law. People can argue about what Parliament might do in the future, but I'd be very surprised if New Zealand was ever prepared to consider that, and it's certainly not being considered in this law.
The other issue raised is that the line may be blurry around what is considered a grievous and irremediable medical condition. And some of the conditions that have been raised that may qualify are cystic fibrosis, diabetes, dementia, rheumatoid arthritis, gluten intolerance was one of the ones named. What's off limit for you? Well,
first of all, who's saying that?
It's contained in the report.
So some submitters have said that. It doesn't mean that it's a valid opinion. None of those would be able to qualify unless they fitted a variety of other conditions. They'd have to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. They would have to be people who, in their own view, could not be have their suffering alleviated in any other way. They would have to be people who are of sound mind and able to decide and make a decision and understand the ramifications of the decision for themselves. I think if you think back through those criteria, then none of the cases that you named would actually qualify. Having said that, we're actually proposing to remove the condition of having to be grievous and irremediable anyway, and leave it for people who have a prognosis of terminal illness within 6 months. So I think, frankly,
so only terminal illness. You're going to go to only terminal illness.
Yeah, that's right. So just to go back a step, the fact that the report has acknowledged that one of the 38,000 submitters said something doesn't actually make it correct. Number two is that it is not true that any of those people that you named could have accessed
cystic fibrosis.
The bill. Well, they'd have to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. So that is something that, potentially they could, but the idea that merely having cystic fibrosis would qualify you for an assisted death under the bill as drafted is absolutely untrue. But thirdly, Lisa, the proposal is and I don't think the bill will pass otherwise, to take the conditions of people with a grievous and irremediable condition and no terminal illness out of the criteria anyway. So there's 3 different reasons why that may be in the report, but it's frankly mischievous and misleading to say that that's an implication of this bill.
How many people would qualify right now under the definitions that you've just stated, the scope of the bill? How many people would qualify to go down this process of assisted death?
So if you look at the sort of spectrum of countries that have bills like this, ours is towards the more conservative end of that spectrum, particularly as is proposed to make it terminal only. In countries at the more conservative end of the spectrum, and I'm mostly talking about the American states such as Oregon, you end up with about 0.5% of all people who die using the bill. Countries at the more liberal end, where they allow people to do things in different ways,
That's people who exercise their right, though, isn't it, Mr. Seymour? That's people who exercise their right. My question is how many would be in that group who were able to access this legislation if they wanted to?
Yeah, that's not a figure that I have.
Right.
But you can work backwards from the numbers that I've given you. So if I can just finish answering that question, because people might be interested in how many people actually use it as well. In the American states, it's about 0.5% of all people who die. So in New Zealand, you're looking at around about 100 or 200 people per year perhaps who might actually use the bill. In the more liberal states, it's more like 2%. So you might be looking at 400 to 600 people per year. In Canada, which we're reasonably close to, it's about 1% of all people. How many people might be eligible? Well, it would be the number of people who at any given time have a terminal illness, but in a way I think that's the wrong question, because one of the criteria of eligibility is that you have to believe that this is the right and only way to end your particular suffering. If you don't believe that, then you fail at one of the eligibility criteria, and that's why I answered the question the way I did, that you're both the same.
What about coercion? Because that is a concern for a lot of people, that people who are terminally ill may feel like they're a burden on others. They may feel coerced by family members or anyone. What about coercion, Mr. Seymour?
If I thought there was a problem with coercion, I wouldn't be doing this. You've got to remember I'm a libertarian. I believe that people should be free to make their own choices. How do you know there's not going to be a problem with coercion, though? How can you be so sure about that? Well, I was just about to answer that question. Like I was saying, my personal set of views are that if there was coercion and if that was an issue, I wouldn't be doing this. I would be prevented by my own view of the world from having ever gone down this path. How did I satisfy myself, and why do I think people should be satisfied that coercion is not an issue? Well, like many of these things, it's good to step away from the speculation that you hear from those motivated opponents within New Zealand and start examining the hard data from overseas. And what we find there is that the people who access assisted dying are people who are generally more likely to have access to palliative care, people who are more likely to have health care in countries where that's private, people who are more usually wealthier, usually more educated, people who are used to making their own decisions throughout their lives. Now, if it was the other way around, and the people who were using assisted dying were overwhelmingly people who perhaps had less access to palliative and health care, people who were less used to making their own choices throughout life, then you might think, well, geez, the overriding mode here is people are being pushed into it. I think what the data actually shows us is that this is something that people make as a choice for themselves, and that's the data from all around the world where it's been used.
David Seymour there.